What is zone two? Why is it important? How can you measure it? And how should you integrate that zone two training into your weekly routine? Whether you're trying to perform at the highest level or you're just trying to stay healthy, in this presentation, I'm going to share with you everything that I've learned so far about zone two training. Thanks to everything that I've read so far through books and studies, but especially through the dozens of athletes that I've been able to test in person and coach through my training programs. I share everything with you in this video. It's a long form presentation, so it's a little bit different than the usual content that I post on the channel. Make sure you let me know in the comments what you think about this slightly more detailed content. By the way, if you're new to the channel, my name is Sean and welcome to Upside Strength. After having coached more than 100 CrossFit, MMA, and endurance sport athletes, and having seen through my own experience the importance and benefits of Zone 2 work, I decided to share with you in this presentation everything that I've learned so far about it. So this guide will help you finally understand its usefulness, its benefits, what it really means, and how you can measure or estimate your Zone 2 regardless of your current context. At the end of this presentation, I'll also explain to you exactly how you can integrate this Zone 2 training into your routine for both performance and health, which modalities to use, how long, etc. And I'll also tell you about the 5 mistakes that I see a lot of people make when including Zone 2 training, mistakes that you should avoid at all costs. So be sure to watch this video until the end. So we'll start with a quick overview of what we have going on today's presentation. We'll start in chapter 1 with the definition of Zone 2, what it actually represents. Chapter 2, we'll talk about adaptations. It'll be a little bit technical, so if you wish to skip over that and go straight to number 3, feel free to do so with the chapters. At the bottom of this video, we'll talk about Zone 2 benefits, how to measure and estimate them in Chapter 4, how to integrate Zone 2 into your routine in Chapter 5, the common mistakes that I see, and a few examples of progress you can expect by doing your Zone 2 work properly. So first we'll start with what is Zone 2. So those are some common terms that you'll usually see floating around and usually associated with Zone 2 training. So we have base training, fundamental endurance, low intensity training. All those things kind of mean the same thing and will usually be found in the popular language in endurance sports. So again, all of those correspond to low intensity training, usually done in a cyclical modality. So think about cycling, walking, running, and it's often set aside for more high intensity training, at least in the last few years as it's been done. One thing to remember is that Zone 2 or that low intensity literally just forms the base of your pyramid when it comes to conditioning in general. And so what we develop with this kind of work supports all the high intensity efforts, supports our recovery. And so we should think of it as such, as the base of the pyramid, not just something that some people do for their sport. So let's go back to this little slide here. And if you were to remember only one thing from this presentation, I would say that this is what I wish you take out of this this presentation, is that the base is necessary regardless of your sport or discipline, or whether it's for your sport or for your health goals as well. So we're going to now talk a little bit about physiology, but I promise I'll keep it as simple as possible. I think you'll see it's pretty straightforward to understand. So what you see here is what we call intensity domains. Intensity domains, they describe our physiology. We can measure them, and we'll see that a little bit later on. But to make it easy, we have the green one here, which is the moderate intensity domain. And you can see the smiley face illustrates the type of intensity that we're talking about. The heavy domain is in yellow and the severe domain is in red. And so what we're going to see here with those little scales is that you can see in the moderate domain, the workload is fairly low and the body can cope really well with it, okay? The body doesn't have any issue dealing with that stress and can tolerate it really, really well. Now, if we go to the heavy domain, we can see that you can see the scale is bending a little bit. So there's definitely a strain on the system, but the body can still manage that effort. The body can respond and bear the workload that is imposed upon it here in that intensity domain. But now if we go to the severe domain, we see that the scale has bent and it has also tilted to one side. The workload is too big and the body cannot maintain its internal balance anymore. And this is kind of if you understand this and this overall picture, I think it'll make your life much easier for later on in this presentation. And just in general, understanding those different physiological responses when it comes to conditioning is very useful and important. So if we go back here, we have the physiology at the top that we just described, and we have the zones. So what are zones? They're nothing more than simply, let's say, a way to organize training in a more precise manner. A good friend of mine, Jim Arnold, says that domains are descriptive, so they describe our physiology. Zones are prescriptive, which means that we can prescribe training using the zones. And so where is zone 2 in all of this? Zone 2 is down here. Okay, zone 2 is down here, and it's in the moderate domain, and it's just beside what is called the first threshold. So a threshold is simply a transition between two distinct internal states, or two different responses from the body to exercise. So as you can see, when we go from the moderate to the heavy domain, there's a threshold. And when we go to from the heavy domain to the severe domain, there's another threshold there. Okay, so there's two main thresholds, and we'll see how we can measure more specifically that first threshold a little bit later on. But just remember that threshold is a transition between two internal states. And so if we look at the first threshold, if we were able to determine this, now we're going to be able to determine that top of our zone 2. Bear in mind that some people use a slightly different definition of zone 2. So we have to account for that. I'll remind you that everything that I'm saying here in this presentation is what I've learned and understood so far. It doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that it's right. And there are other perspectives out there. So just keep that in mind as you go along with this presentation. So the first threshold, as we talked about, is the top of zone 2. So we'll often define it with a power or a speed value, whether we're cycling or running, for example, and we'll usually associate that with a given heart rate as well. Okay, so on the bike, you'll have a power number and a heart rate number associated with it. And in running, you'll have a speed number and a heart rate number as well. We'll come back into more detail into this in a minute. One thing to understand is that each person is going to have their own threshold, their own zone 2, and their own associated heart rate value to this. Okay, we can see Mr. Green here on the left, who's got a first threshold, so top of zone 2 at 150 watts, and that is the equivalent to 130 beats per minute for him. But if we look at Mr. Blue on the right, his threshold is at 225 watts, so his top of zone 2 is much higher than Mr. Green's. But the heart rate doesn't change that much compared to Mr. Green. He's at 135 beats per minute. So remember that for two different people, you're going to have different threshold values and potentially different heart rates as well. And even if we were to take just Mr. Green in and of himself, if we change modality, so if we go from cycling to running, for example, the watts there's no equivalent at this point for watt and speed directly, or at least not in the context of this video, but essentially every modality is going to have its own delineation of that first threshold. And so a bike is going to have a different threshold than a run, than a swim, than on a rower, etc., etc. There's multiple reasons for this. The body position is different. The amount of muscle mass that's recruited is different. The way blood is pushed around the body is slightly different. Different muscular contractions having an impact on blood flow. So all those things lead us to conclude and to realize, I mean, just from observation as well, that different modalities are going to have different thresholds. So it's important to recognize that. If we were to summarize quickly what we saw in this first chapter, in this first section here, so zone 2 is the training zone that is just before the first threshold. Okay, this is where the body's response to exercise changes. And we'll see what the actual difference is a little bit later on in more detail. It's also characterized by an internal steady state at the cellular level. We'll see that a little bit later for more detail. Zone 2 can differ and change from one person to the next. And it's also going to change whether we're running, cycling, etc. So each modality has its own reading. And also remember that that zone 2, that top of zone 2, that first threshold is dynamic. Okay, it's not fixed. It will change slightly from one day to the next with fatigue, with hydration and nutrition status. It will change. Hopefully, if you do your training right, it will change significantly over time. But we'll see again in the integration chapter that you need to allow time to see those adaptations happen. But in a nutshell, this is what we want to remember. And again, it's dynamic, so it's going to change over time. It's not just fixed and it's never going to move. Now let's talk about the effects or what adaptations we can see from zone 2 training, from low intensity training. It's a slightly technical chapter, so if you do not want to see this kind of information, you can skip to chapter 3. But if you wish to see a little bit more, stay with me and let's jump right into it. So we're going to look at central and peripheral adaptations. The first central adaptation I want to talk about is at the level of the nervous system, more specifically at the level of the autonomic nervous system. So we know we have those two branches, and I'm going to talk about this in the next chapter again, so I won't go into too much detail here, but we have that parasympathetic branch and that sympathetic branch, sympathetic being the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic being the rest and digest and socialize branch of our autonomic nervous system. Again, I'm simplifying here so that everybody understands. And the low intensity training is going to have a parasympathetic dominant aspect to it. And so, especially if somebody's very stressed out, if somebody's already doing a lot of high intensity training, this zone 2 or low intensity training is going to help them balance themselves out from a nervous system standpoint, okay? Bringing more of that parasympathetic into the mix, and again, finding a good balance between the two. We'll get back to this a little bit later. Another aspect that's going to improve is heart rate variability. And if you ask a cardiologist, they'll usually tell you that increased or improved heart rate variability will be a sign of good health, and it's something that you see especially in younger people. That's always something good to strive towards, having a great balance between those two, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And at the same time, what we're going to see as an adaptation from this type of training is often a lowered heart rate at rest. Okay, there's another factor that comes into play on this aspect. We'll look at it just after, but know that the parasympathetic dominant aspect of this type of work is one of the reasons why endurance athletes usually display low heart rates at rest. Another reason is the size of the heart, and more specifically about the left ventricle. So one thing that we're going to see through this low intensity training is what we call eccentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle. And so what's happening is essentially we're stretching the left ventricle. We're making it bigger so that it can pump more blood with each beat. And so it's essentially a bit more economy on the heart as well. It doesn't have to pump as much to push the same amount of blood around the organism. And again, you have a bigger heart, quote unquote, and you pair that up with that parasympathetic dominance that we saw just before on a nervous system standpoint. And we have as a result of these two, we have lowered heart rates at rest. And we again see that especially in well-trained endurance athletes. Another aspect, adaptation that we can look forward to is from a vascular standpoint. So we're going to have an improved vasodilated capacity. Essentially, blood flow very simply pushes against the endothelium, so the walls of your blood vessels as it flows through, and this is going to trigger the release of different compounds, nitric oxide, adenosine, and other vasodilating factors, which are going to essentially allow you to open the pipes, so to speak, and make more space for more blood to come through, bringing oxygen to the working muscles, getting the byproducts out and circulating back into the systemic circulation once they're produced and cannot be reutilized locally. So this is a big adaptation that we get from this type of work. It's essentially your increased capacity to move blood around the body and to respond to the demand of oxygen from the working muscles. Remember that you always have kind of that interplay between the nervous system and the systemic circulation, where as let's say you're cycling, so your legs are demanding more oxygen, and so what the body does is that it's going to quote unquote open the pipes to allow for more blood to flow through and more oxygen to reach the working muscle. But you also have the nervous system that is trying to regulate blood pressure around the body. And so you're always going to have this tug of war between sympathetic vasoconstriction and metabolic vasodilation. Those two things kind of play with each other. And the better your body is able to vasodilate from a metabolic standpoint, the more it's going to, quote unquote, be able to counteract that vasoconstriction from a nervous system standpoint, and just keep the blood going. And that's especially valuable at high intensities. So it's something that you develop at low intensity, but then it's something that you carry over into the whole spectrum of exercise intensity, obviously. If we talk about another central adaptation, we could talk about transport, the transport of oxygen inside the blood itself. So what we're going to see with endurance training, and more particularly low intensity training, we're going to see an increase in plasma volume, an increase in hemoglobin as well. Hemoglobin is the transporter, is the protein that is going to catch those molecules of oxygen at the lung and bring them all the way to the working muscles, to the organs, to the heart, etc., to the brain, etc., etc. Essentially, you could pretty much say that zone 2 is legal doping, in the sense that if you look at the EPO that is produced by your kidneys, so again, it's a substance that is produced naturally, but it could also be taken up from an exogenous standpoint to add to those levels, and this is going to have a tremendously positive impact on oxygen transport through the blood. So again, if you do your zone 2, you could almost call that legal doping if you really wanted to. Next, we'll talk about peripheral adaptations. So here we'll talk about capillary density. What's a capillary? It's one of those tiny little pipes that essentially plays the role of the interface between your systemic circulation and your muscle fibers. And so essentially all those little capillaries around the fibers allow for oxygen to pass from the blood into the muscle fiber. This is where this exchange happens. And the way you have to think about this is that by increasing the density of capillaries, by increasing how many of those tiny little pipes you develop around your muscle fibers, you're going to be able to pass more oxygen at any given intensity or per unit of time to the muscle fiber. And another adaptation that kind of stems from that, which is really interesting, is that as you get more capillary density around you, especially your type 1 fibers, what you're going to see is that the blood flow for a given workload actually decreases to that area, simply because for a given amount of blood that comes through, with more capillaries, you're able to extract more oxygen. And so the body's seeing that, hey, we don't need to bring as much blood because we can pull out a lot of oxygen quickly thanks to that high capillary density, allows you to spare some blood. So this is a really, really important adaptation that is going to have an effect at all levels of intensity. Again, because we're able to just pass more oxygen to the working muscle, we're able to better recycle everything that comes out of it. So that's a really important adaptation that we're looking at. An analogy to kind of drive this home is it's just like understanding when cabs drop people off at the airport so they can go and catch their plane. We see what, 2, 4, 6, 8 cabs here. Now imagine you only have 4. Okay, there's only 4 parking spots for those taxi cabs. You can transport about 4 people per cab, which funnily enough matches how many oxygen molecules you can carry with 1 molecule of hemoglobin. And so from that, we have 4 cabs, we have 4 people per cab, 16 people total. Let's say it takes them a minute to get their bags out and get going, and the taxi to move. So this is how many people we can move per minute, right? You can only move 16 people per minute or drop them off to go and take their next flight. Now, if you were to 10x the number of spots that the cabs can have, so the drop-off zone becomes much, much bigger. Now you can drop off virtually 160 people per minute because you have that many more parking spots, and then you can have that much more transfer of people from the taxi to the airport per unit of time. This is what we're looking at when it comes to increasing capillary density, and essentially you're going to be able to offload a lot more oxygen per unit of time to your working muscle. This capillary development goes hand in hand with mitochondrial development. So you see them here, you see them behind me over here as well. Mitochondria is also coined the powerhouse of the cell. This is where cellular respiration happens. So more mitochondria in general just means better metabolic health. You're going to see an increase in VO2 max as well if we talk about performance metrics. And what's interesting is that they actually don't exist in such a form. They're not free-floating organelles, although we thought they were for a long time. I still like to represent them like this because it's just a catchy image. In reality, it's more of a network, right? We actually call it the mitochondrial reticulum now, and it serves many purposes besides just essentially breaking down substrates and performing oxidative phosphorylation. There's many other things that happen. Transport of substrates along the lining, the walls of the different mitochondrial organelles, and again, there's a whole network that exists within our cells and within specifically our muscle cells. Because of what we're talking about here, and I invite you to go and dig that topic of mitochondria. It's really fascinating what's happening, inside our cells. Technically, they're an entity that has a different DNA than we do, which is, if I'm not mistaken, passed down from the mother. So you have the mitochondrial DNA that your mother had. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, obviously. So again, yeah, it's a network, and we develop that network through that low intensity training. Another thing that is linked directly to this is that, and it's an oversimplification, but I think it serves its purpose here. The more mitochondria you have, the less you're going to activate glycolysis, which is simply the breakdown of glycogen and glucose, so sugars, and thus the more you oxidize fat. Okay, so as you can see here, a professional cyclist has a huge amount of mitochondria, very high mitochondrial volume density, as we call it, inside his working muscles. And as a result of this, he is able to oxidize a high amount of fat in order to recycle ATP. If we look at a moderately active data here, he's going to have a much lower capacity to oxidized fats. And finally, for somebody suffering from metabolic disease, or metabolic syndrome, sorry, this is what this might look like. This graph is adapted from a study by Inigo Samanon, and all in 2018, reference in the description of the video if you want to dig that a little bit more. And what's very interesting and useful in terms of why is fat oxidation important? People will tell you, yeah, but it's less efficient. You need more oxygen to break down a certain amount of free fatty acids compared to glycogen or glucose. And the idea is that the main difference is in how much carbohydrates and how much fats we have available as substrates inside the human body. Okay, and when we're talking about fats here, we're talking about fats that are free fatty acids that are available for use from a substrate standpoint. It's not how much body fat you have. Even say a lean male of 60 or 70 kgs still has a lot of fat available as substrate, because those stores are within the cells and again within the body and not necessarily displayed as body fat. And so to proportion, that's pretty much what it's going to look like. 3,000 kilocalories of carbohydrates and 70,000 kilocalories of fat are some of the numbers that I found. They might not be exact, but just remember you have more than 20 times more fat stores than carbohydrate stores. And so what matters is that when you performing any type of heavy or severe intensity exercise or even extreme, so when we're talking, above that moderate intensity domain, above where that zone 2 is, anytime you go above, you're going to start using significant amounts of glycogen, of sugars. And so if you have really good fat oxidation capacity, what you're going to do is spare your glycogen, keep it for later, which means you're going to be able to switch back quicker after you come out of a high intensity bout. And you're also going to be able to, again, spare that glycogen for when you really need it at the higher intensities, because without the glycogen, nothing really happens at high intensities, or at least not for long at all. So the more fat you can use, the more efficient you are, and you'll keep that glycogen for later. Another benefit of developing that mitochondrial network, that mitochondrial reticulum, is to increase our ability to recycle lactate. Lactate is the byproduct of glycolysis. Lactate is not a harmful byproduct of metabolism. It is simply an energetic buffer or an energetic intermediate, let's say, between the breakdown of sugars and then oxidation within the mitochondria. So lactate can be transported and oxidized inside the mitochondria. We know this now. And so if you have more mitochondria, you can better recycle lactate. Remember, lactate is produced at all intensities, even at rest. Right now, I'm producing lactate. My lactate concentration in the blood is not zero. It's never going to be zero. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. So you always have lactate. You always produce it. You produce more at higher intensities. And if you have the infrastructure, if you have the mitochondria, if you've done that low intensity training, you're able to better recycle that excess lactate that is going to accumulate at some point at the higher intensities. So this is another point that is very interesting from an adaptation standpoint. So if we were to quickly summarize, look over all the adaptations we can expect from a low intensity and zone 2 training, we have an increased autonomic balance at the nervous system level. We have increased left ventricle size in the heart, increased vasodilator capacity, increased hemoglobin concentration, increased blood volume, increased capillary density, decreased blood volume needed for a given amount of work, increased mitochondrial density, increased fat oxidation, increased glycogen sparing, increased lactate recycling, all those good things from that zone 2 training. And now if we go to a slightly simpler version of what we just talked about in the adaptations, why train zone 2? So in my opinion, at this point, again, given simply what I've learned and seen and done so far, to me, it seems normal to say that zone 2 training should be part of any regular training program, whether you're training for performance or for health. And I would even argue, especially for health, this type of training has to be part of your weekly routine. We often talk about the importance of all the high intensity, and it has its place. I'm not on team zone 2 only. I think that a good training program has all the components into it, organized in a coherent way. But again, zone 2 has to be part of that conversation. If we simply talk about its benefits for health, okay, from a metabolic standpoint, from a cardiovascular standpoint, from a, if you have better cardiorespiratory health, you will live a longer and better life on average. You will be less likely to die from all-cause mortality. So we know those things. And so why would you not give yourself, hedge your bets and do that work so that you can get those benefits no matter what your situation is. If we talk about the nervous system, we have two branches in the autonomic nervous system. One is called the parasympathetic branch, and the other one is called the sympathetic branch. The parasympathetic is usually associated with rest and digest and socializing. The sympathetic branch is usually associated with a fight or flight. So for anybody who spends a lot of time in stressful situations, whether it's at work or with their sport, I think of sports like CrossFit, MMA, which I work with. You see a lot of intensity and a lot of intensity and a lot of intensity. And so what the result usually is that somebody goes really, really far on the sympathetic side of things, but forgets to kind of come back to the parasympathetic side. And as I mentioned earlier, zone 2 training is predominantly parasympathetic in nature. And so with that zone 2 training, you'll be able to find a better balance from a nervous system standpoint. Again, it's going to lower your heart rate at rest. It's going to help counteract that intensity and just be more balanced overall. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to be all the way on the parasympathetic side all the time. What matters is variability, is the ability to go from one end of the spectrum to the next as you require. And again, being stuck in one side is never a good option. So you want to have that variability, and that low intensity training gives you that ability if you've spent a lot of time doing high intensity stuff. Another benefit we'll see is improved recovery, whether it's between sets, whether it's between sessions. If you talk to a CrossFit competitor, they'll note some better recovery between events in a weekend or 3-day or 4-day competition. Better recovery even between exercises in the same workout. So during the transitions, all those things are going to be one of the main features of zone 2 training. So improved recovery at all levels. And I've seen this across the board, whether it's for CrossFit athletes, MMA athletes, endurance athletes, obviously, but even sports you wouldn't think about, power athletes, power lifting athletes. I've spoken to people who practice parkour as a discipline, and noted really much better recovery between their runs, which are very explosive in nature again, right? So you wouldn't necessarily associate that off the bat to zone 2 training, but I've really seen that across the board. No matter what the sporting discipline is, if you want to recover better, if you feel like your recovery is one of your weaknesses or something that you need to work on, this zone 2 training is going to help you with it. Another benefit is going to be increased stress and training load tolerance, being able to bear the load. I think that's a really important point. And again, whether it's from a health standpoint, just bearing the load of everyday life, of daily stressors, or from an athletic standpoint, just tolerating your training volume, that zone 2 is instrumental in pivotal in order to get those benefits. So if you train a lot and you don't feel like you recover well enough to finish all your training sessions with a positive note or in a positive way, then you're probably lacking some overall volume tolerance, and this type of work is going to help you. I've had multiple athletes come back to me after they've done that type of training, and for example, they told me that, hey, beforehand, before I trained, before I used zone 2 training, I would get to the Friday and be really tired, couldn't finish my week properly, so I was tired from my Friday sessions, tired from my Saturday sessions, and since including that and doing all the work, I can really hit a strong week of training all the way into Saturday. Those athletes usually take 2 days off, Thursday and Sunday, but they can really now kind of work through their whole week of training without getting hammered by the volume too much, because they can now tolerate it. So that load tolerance, I think, is very interesting from an athletic standpoint, especially as we know that more and more in professional sports, especially, you see that trend towards more training volume as one of the main drivers of results. So you don't have a choice. If you want to train more and train better, you need to include some of that work. The durability is also another benefit from that zone 2 training. So just being more resistant to fatigue. It goes back to what I was saying before in terms of recovery, but especially on longer events. And you see that in cycling now, where they've been able to look at, and I think Peter Leo and his group have been studying this, and if I get the names wrong or the conclusions wrong, I'm sorry, and please correct me in the comments below. But what they looked at is that essentially athletes that did a high proportion of low intensity training, zone 2 type training, had usually better results later in the race. And in cycling, for example, you're going to ride for 4 or 5 hours, and then you're going to have to hit it hard for the time it'll take you to win the event. And again, it doesn't matter what you can do fresh, it matters what you can do after 4 or 5 hours of riding for those athletes. And that proportion of zone 2 training, essentially the higher the proportion of zone 2 training, the more you do, the better you'll be able to retain all your, say, fresh abilities later into the race and display them later into the race. So if you have a hard time finishing your games with your team sport athletes, or finishing your races strong if you're an endurance athlete, then that low intensity training might be what you need. We can also talk about economy as a benefit from this low intensity training. Essentially, your engine is going to consume less per kilometer traveled. We can also talk about it from an economy of movement standpoint. If you think about CrossFit, which is highly geared towards mechanical efficiency, obviously, but energetic efficiency is just as important. So again, if every rep can cost you a little bit less, which means you have a little bit more left for the end of that training session, for the end of that workout, for the end of that competition, that's always something to strive towards. And same in health. Why don't we make every movement as costless as possible, or every movement cost the least amount possible from an energetic standpoint, so that we again just get less affected by small things every day. So again, those benefits, we are going to be building up that base. And if you have a deficient base, everything's going to suffer from it. But if you increase that base, everything rises with it. This is an important and a very important point to remember. Another way to visualize it is, again, to see it from that perspective. And if you increase that low intensity training and do it at the right intensity, we'll come to that in a second, everything will move up on the intensity spectrum. So now how do we measure or how do we estimate zone 2 depending on what equipment we have available, or if we don't have any equipment, how do we do it? We're going to cover that as well when it comes to measuring thresholds and especially that first threshold. Remember that zone 2 is just below that transition between the moderate and the heavy intensity domains. And so what we want to do is determine that first threshold. There's multiple ways to measure that. And again, there's multiple methods of interpretation of those data. So what I'm presenting here is my perspective. It's an N of 1, and it's not the whole truth. And other professionals, other practitioners will have a slightly different or maybe completely different perspective on what I'm putting forward here. But I think, again, I'm just trying to get the point across as to how we can look at those things. And if there's some slight inconsistencies with other approaches, I can totally accept that. That's no problem to me. So there's two main ways of looking at that first threshold. Essentially, we have to measure physiological parameters in order to be able to determine that first threshold. The first way to do this is with lactate. Again, we talked about lactate before as being the end product of glycolysis. And what happens is that at a certain point, it's going to start accumulating in the blood above resting levels. So if we look at those resting levels here at the bottom, illustrated by the blue line, and we look at the first point that is slightly above that, those resting values, or those low intensity values that are close to resting levels, essentially here what I'm displaying is what we call baseline plus 0.5, which means that you take the baseline lactate reading, and as soon as your lactate reading goes above that baseline by more than 0.5 millimoles per liter, this is where you're going to draw the line. So what I'm displaying here is some fictitious points on a scale. Keep in mind that the duration of the interval matters. I use 4-minute intervals. I'll talk about this in a minute, but you can use up to 8, 9, 10-minute intervals to do so. So what I tend to do while using those 4-minute steps, which arguably is a little bit, it's on the shorter end of what you'd want to do for lactate testing, and I accept that as a criticism. So what I do is I'm just very conservative with where I'm going to draw my line. So wherever I see the plus 0.5 over baseline, I go to the previous point, and this is where I draw my line. Again, there's different methods to do this. This is just what I've settled on so far, because it seems to work well for me and the athletes that I work with. So again, we have that threshold, we draw that line, and we're going to place our zone 2 below that value, and it's going to have both a power reading, if we're talking about watts here on a bike, and an associated heart rate reading as well. And going back to what we were talking about before, essentially the moderate intensity domain, as far as I understand it, displays a cellular steady state, okay? Or at least I find that it's a nice model to think about. So essentially, the workload that you're imposing on the organism can be managed at the cellular level itself, meaning it doesn't have to outsource some of its recycling to the systemic circulation, for example, in the case of that increase in lactate concentration above baseline that we see once we cross that first threshold and once we go into that heavy intensity domain, because now essentially the cells themselves cannot maintain that steady state anymore. And so what we see is accumulated lactate within the systemic circulation, which means to me that we're not in a cellular steady state anymore. We're in a systemic steady state now. So essentially, once the cells can't bear the load, it goes to the whole organism. And once the whole organism cannot bear the load anymore, cannot maintain that balance internally, then we go to the severe domain and we lose that internal steady state. And I find that cell to organism a nice model. It's a kind of a fractal model. We have balance at the cellular level in the moderate domain, balance at the systemic level in the heavy domain, and we lose that steady state in the severe domain. So again, I was talking about what protocol I used. I used a 4-minute on, 1-minute off protocol. I try to get about 10 steps throughout this whole intensity distribution. And obviously I calibrate the test so it matches the level of the athlete. So a well-trained cyclist might start at 150 watts and do 25 to 30 watt increments on the test like this. If I'm starting with maybe a 60 kilogram female, a CrossFit, athlete on the intermediate side, I might start at 60, 70 watts and only do 10 or maybe 15 watt jumps. So the intensity itself is really going to be dictated by the level of the person themselves. And what the minute of rest does, it allows me to take a good lactate sample, first and foremost. And second, it allows me to also quantify heart rate recovery in that minute of rest and get ready for the next step going forward. Again, 4 minutes is on the shorter side of what you'd want to do for lactate testing. And this is why I use quite a conservative interpretation of those lactate readings. But you can definitely push those steps to 6, 8, 10 minutes. I know Inigo Samalan talks about 10-minute steps for his pro riders, but then there's also the level of the athlete that comes into play. If I were to do 10-minute levels with somebody who's not well trained, well, they wouldn't be able to do a 90-minute or 120-minute test. They never spend that amount of time on a bike to begin with. So here you go for what I use for a protocol. And now the other way of determining that first threshold is going to be from a ventilatory standpoint. Okay, so what happens is VO2, so the volume of oxygen that the body utilizes, increases linearly with intensity, meaning that the harder you go, the more oxygen you consume. And in general, this is true. But what is interesting is that ventilation, how much air we breathe, does not follow this same linear pattern. What we have is a correspondence between ventilation and oxygen consumption up to what we call the first ventilatory threshold. And so again, we see a departure in trend from ventilation compared to VO2 at that first inflection point. This is another way of measuring that first threshold and determine that zone 2 intensity. Now, that's a simplified version of how this works. If you want to dig into ventilatory thresholds a bit more and figure out all the different methods that are currently available to do so, I recommend this paper by Kier et al. From 2021, link in the description again. But just know that you can measure essentially that first inflection point at the ventilatory and VO2 end as well. You can also look at CO2 or different metrics of CO2. One last way, which is currently not quote unquote validated and not recognized as a way of determining thresholds, at least I would say not by the majority of people. One of the reasons being that most people don't have access to this tool and haven't used it enough to draw those conclusions, but that's a debate for another video. What we do see here, what I have seen over and over again, is an inflection point, sometimes clearer than others, but just like on a lactate curve, it's not necessarily, we've determined a baseline and we've determined that this is the method of interpretation. So I guess there's more variability on the muscle oximetry side of things. So if you look at SMO2, the muscle saturation of O2 at the capillary level, you will see an inflection point as well. And so what I do is I listed those different methods: lactate, ventilation, VO2, and muscle oximetry here. So I've decided that I wasn't smart enough to pick which method was the best, so I just measure all of them and then try to find the best interpretation in the middle to help the athletes that I work with. But this is, again, just another way of seeing those differences from one internal state to the other. One thing that comes up a lot is, yeah, but what about just taking 70% of heart rate max? What about that? The issue with that is that the 220 minus age approach or equation is wrong. I don't think there's a better way to say this. It's just wrong. And the reason being is that there's huge variability from one person to the next. Okay, for you, it might be 220 minus your age. You might fall perfectly on your heart rate max. For another, it might be 15 beats too high. For yet another person, it might be 15 beats too low. You see this huge spread of points on this graph here. So just taking the trend line from this data set does not make sense insofar as calculating a max heart rate, and even less than just take a percentage based off of that estimated heart rate. It's one thing to measure a max heart rate, but estimating one, you might be right on the spot, you might be completely off base. And then by taking a fixed percentage, one of the issues is that I've seen between 55 and 80% of heart rate max, of measured heart rate max, correspond to that first threshold and to the top of zone 2 for any individual. So again, there's a huge variability depending on what population you're measuring. And again, it's also going to change depending on what modality you're testing. So why use this equation to find a max heart rate that might even not be your max heart rate, that might be your max heart rate for one modality but not another, because usually, for example, you'll have a higher max heart rate running than cycling. And then take a fixed percentage off of this doesn't make any sense to me. Plus, as we talked about in the beginning, this first threshold is dynamic in nature. It is going to change over time. And if all you do is take 70% of max heart rate and you never move that needle, well, what do you have? You have a fixed threshold, and that's not what we want. We want those thresholds to change. We want to be able to measure that change so that we can adjust our training zones and keep training at the right intensity for us, for our own physiology. Another illustration of this is the zones that you might get from a Polar device. And I didn't pick them for any particular reason. It's just the data that I had from this athlete, Antoine, that I tested a few months ago. And what you can see is a pretty significant difference between his the zones that were calculated by his watch and the zones that we established for him following his test. So again, the zones that your watch gives you, maybe they might be exactly right for you. Okay, I have to say it, they might be right for you, but they might be very wrong as well. And you might be 10, 15 beats, sometimes 20 beats off where you should be. And you're thinking that, for example, Antoine here, if at 130 beats per minute, or let's say 125 beats per minute, he thought he was still in zone 2. Well, it looks like he's more kind of bottom of zone 3, middle of zone 3, according to his physiological data. So we have to take that into consideration and not look at fixed percentages of max heart rates to establish zones, because it does not work. So what happens if we don't have all those measurement tools, lactate, ventilation, SMO2? How can we estimate our zone 2 in order to still get all the benefits of that type of training, but without breaking the bank or going to a specialist to do the testing? So I would say that I do recommend, if you're a competitive athlete or you're trying to achieve some performance goals in any type of endurance event, and even if you're not, I work with a lot of CrossFitters, I work with a lot of MMA athletes, and they rarely have to compete on a bike. But the fact of the matter is, testing them and then getting them to train in a coherent manner on whether it's this or running really has a tremendous impact on their development. So again, back to estimating that zone 2. The first one is the talk test. You've heard that one before. It's that simple. Can you hold a conversation? Could you read poetry while doing your zone 2 training? And that's going to be a good indicator that you're respecting that intensity threshold. Okay, this is one way of estimating it. What I like to say to my athletes is that you should be able to be on the phone with someone talking while you do your training, your zone 2 training, and the person on the other side of the line should not be able to know that you're exercising. That would be a good way to make sure you're in zone 2 intensity land. When it comes to RPE, rating of perceived exertion, I usually recommend a 2 to 3 out of 10, simply because 4 and 5 is murky and people usually don't know how to judge themselves. And I'll see people huffing and puffing and telling me they're at 3 out of 10. No, 2 and 3 out of 10 are really easy. Yeah, it's a conversational pace. There is no load on the respiratory system. You're free to breathe and talk normally. And this is usually, again, be a good way to estimate that intensity if you don't have any measurement tools. If you have a heart rate monitor, one thing that you can do is measure your heart rate on a 45 to 60 minute session, for example, where you're supposedly in zone 2. And if you have a nice flat heart rate trend without any increases, you can assume that you're in zone 2 or really not far from zone 2. If, on the contrary, if you see a slight creep up of that heart rate, what we call heart rate drift, Again, assuming that you're well fed, assuming that it's not too hot while you're doing it, assuming that you're well hydrated, not fatigued. Then if you see that drift upwards during that low intensity session, it might not be low enough. So those are all good ways of estimating that intensity that you need for zone 2 training if you don't have access to advanced measurement tools. How can we integrate that training, that zone 2 training, into a weekly schedule? And we'll talk about different situations. I think the first thing to think about is to think about a cyclical modality, okay? I love cycling and walking. I think they're fantastic. And we can even do a run-walk kind of combo for people that are slightly better conditioned, and running in zone 2 is possible as well. But for the vast majority of people, unless you're a competitive runner of a significantly high level already, I've seen many people that say that they can run in zone 2, but really when you measure what's going on internally for those people, they say they're in zone 2, but they're not. They're probably 3 or above. And so again, I usually recommend people start with cycling, because you don't have to bear the load of your own body, which does make it easier from a systemic standpoint. Or you can start with walking, or alternate walking and jogging. That's a really good way to start accumulating some running volume without doing too much, without hurting yourself. I work with a lot of CrossFitters, which are usually a little bit heavier on the body weight side, given the demands of their sport. And if you get a CrossFitter to start running off the bat, they're unable, for the very vast majority, to actually run in zone 2. So I start with an easy progression of run walk. So they'll do 1 minute run, 1 minute walk, and then they'll bring that up to 2 minute run, 1 minute walk. And the running is always really easy. And we'll just build that up over time. If we're talking about a bike, we might stay around 80 rounds per minute. In terms of cadence, something comfortable is usually what I'll recommend. Now, if we talk about time, duration, for somebody who's competitive, and I'm not talking about the elite endurance athletes here, because most of them will already know all those things and have already implemented zone 2 training with their respective coaches to a high degree. So I'm talking about, people who've never done it before, people who don't do it, people that don't know about it. So what I'd recommend for somebody who's competitive in their sport is 2 to 5 sessions per week, lasting from anywhere from 20 to 90 minutes. And for healthy or health-oriented individuals, I would recommend 2 to 4 sessions weekly, between 20 and 60 minutes per session. Again, if you're a competitive athlete, how much you put into your week, how long are those sessions? This is highly going to depend on what time of season you're in right now, what are your needs, what are your goals, when is the next competition. So all those things have to be tailored individually to your situation, but in general, 2 to 5 sessions is what we're looking at. If we talk about longer sessions, so over 90 minutes, for confirmed athletes, this is something that you can definitely look into and start implementing, but you have to consider the nutritional aspect once you go beyond that hour and a half, and you want to make sure that you fueled appropriately for those longer efforts. Another thing that I like to think about in terms of integration of zone 2 is to avoid technical constraints. Okay, so can you do zone 2 on a rower? Yes, you can. Should everybody do zone 2 on a rower? Most should not, because most people have not earned the right to row for that amount of time, simply because they don't move well enough yet. Okay, for me, from my perspective, again, working a lot with CrossFitters, rowing and skiing, if we talk about the other Concept 2 machine besides the bike, rowing and skiing are technical components that need to be addressed as such before we start layering volume and intensity onto them. Okay, so what I'll do is the vast majority of the physiological development, athletic development that I do with my athletes is going to be on the bike and running, and we're going to do a lot of technical work on the rower and the ski. Obviously, once you reach a certain level of proficiency, you can start using those modalities to do your zone 2 training, but I would really heavily focus on the technique first. And you'll even hear, competitive athletes in indoor rowing on the shorter side of the time domain spectrum. So I've spoken to people that perform at a very high level on the 500 meter row, on the 1,000 meter row, And those people will tell you that they rarely do any low intensity on the rower, simply because it's going to have a negative impact on the quality of their stroke, of the quality of their movement, in order for them to be able to generate 700, 1000 watts on the rower. And so again, avoid technical constraints for most of your zone 2 work. This would be a general prescription, general advice that I would give you. I will let us watch this little video here as we go along. This is Claudia. She's a CrossFit athlete I work with. Here, squat cleaning 108 kilograms at a body weight of 66, I believe, kilos at this point in time. And this was during one of the weeks where she had the most low intensity training that she's ever done so far. We are going to push that up as we keep going forward in time. But just to show you that this whole interference conversation, I'm not saying it's not a valid conversation. I'm just saying that if you do it intelligently, you can absolutely combine low intensity training and explosive power and even strength sports without any detrimental effects. Okay, contrary to popular belief, you can definitely combine strength training, Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, and some doses of low intensity training, more or less, again, depending on the situation, depending on the level of the athlete, etc., etc. And a good way that I like to include this type of low intensity volume for athletes that, again, do not compete in an endurance sport, and maybe they're a powerlifter and they just lack a little bit of recovery and a bit of overall health. And so what we'll do is we'll add, maybe 20 minutes on the bike before you start your squat session. So it's easy, a 20-minute easy before you start your specific warm-up. And then if you finish with a 20-minute cool down on the bike, that makes for a very long session overall, but that's 40 minutes of low intensity training that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And if you do that twice in the week, it's close to an hour and a half of work that you weren't getting before. And from my experience, that's usually enough to move the needle in people that don't do it or haven't done it before. Again, when I talk about integration of zone 2 training, I want to reinforce minimum muscular tension, ease of breathing, low intensity. In my experience, everybody goes too fast, right? The vast majority of people that I've tested so far, let's say 60% of the people that I've worked with so far never did low intensity training before. So now they have to start doing it. And then the other, of the other 40%, 38% of those we're doing zone 2 training, but we're doing it too high, too hard, too intensely. And there's only a small proportion of the people that I've tested so far that actually already did their zone 2 training and already did it at the right intensity. And again, it's okay to adjust from day to day if you have to. Okay, if you're feeling a little more tired, pull it back a little bit on the intensity. If you're feeling good, it's not a reason to go over. If the work is the work, so stay where you need to be. But just remember that most people go too hard. The next point when it comes to integration is try to keep constant blood flow. Okay, think of your blood flow as a river that's going to be digging through bedrock. And so this is what's actually going to be happening when you're developing that capillary density, when you're developing that mitochondrial density. It takes time. Okay, generally when it comes to adaptations and signs, it'll take 8 to 12 weeks for the different benefits to manifest themselves, really, because it takes time. You're changing structures, right? Making more mitochondria, making more capillaries, digging more capillaries out of the structure of your own cells. This takes time, and you have to allow for continuous blood flow through that work in order for this to happen. This is one of the reasons why I don't recommend switching modality while you're doing zone 2 training, right? CrossFitters will often ask me, but can I just do 5-minute bike, 5-minute row, 5-minute ski, 5-minute assault bike, 5-minute lunges, 5-minute this, 5-minute that? We could probably push it to some extent, but you just reach such a level of I'm trying to fit everything into it, and then in the end, it's not the thing that you wanted it to be at the beginning at all anymore. So I'll usually say no. You stick with one modality, and you'll stay on that. And again, we want to avoid that redirection of blood flow around the body. We want to avoid this lower body, upper body, lower body, upper body, because remember that every time you change location of work, let's say, you switch from the bike to the ski, for example, well, your brain now has to start closing the pipes on the legs and opening the pipes on the arms, because the blood flow now needs to go somewhere else. And all that change in, hemodynamics, the way that blood is moved around the body, is going to have an impact on the development of those adaptations we're looking for. So stick with one modality, try not to change, and try to keep all that constant all the way across. Another thing we can think about is nose breathing. I don't think nose breathing is magical in and of itself, but I think that if you can sustain a given intensity while breathing comfortably through your nose, and I emphasize comfortably, because you can definitely do a high intensity session breathing through your nose. It's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be comfortable. So if you can breathe comfortably through your nose, you're probably in or close to your zone 2 intensity. This is definitely something that you can do. To give a little example of this is a training program that I wrote for some CrossFitters, and what you see in green is their zone 2, their volume of low intensity training. And so you can see that the volume varies over time, and those little boxes are the intensity blocks that they're going to place in different sessions through the week. So this is 12 weeks of training. And you can see that in any given week, there's 1, maybe 2 high intensity sessions, but everything happens on a background of zone 2. Okay, that's a kind of a good thing to have in your head, is you want the vast majority of time spent on the bike, in that case, to be low intensity. So you want a good rule of thumb is 80-20, right? You want 80% at low intensity, 20% at high intensity. And if you, obviously my warm-ups all account for low intensity. The cool downs after the intensity count for this as well. So it's really a game of volume. How much volume can we accumulate at the right intensity to then form the base that we need in order to perform in those higher intensity sessions? So that 80-20 split is a good rule of thumb. If we were to bring some synthesis to this integration section for, let's talk about a CrossFit or an MMA competitor, 2 to 5 sessions per week, 20 to 90 minutes per session, 1 to 6 hours per week, although that can go higher for some. And usually bike or walk/run is where we'll do most of that work. And for somebody who has health goals, 2 to 3, 2 to 4 sessions per week, 20 to 60 minutes per session, and 1 to 3 hours per week is what I recommend. Bike or walk, run as well. Again, the walk or the walk run or the run is really going to depend on what level you are at. And just remember that most people train zone 2 too hard. So if you think you're good at running in zone 2, you might want to try the run walk for a while and see what that brings to you. And again, from experience, and you'll see just after in the different examples of progress you might see from this type of work, you might want to lower your intensity just a little bit. 5 mistakes you should avoid when integrating zone 2. Mistake number 1, going too hard. I said it already multiple times. I'll say it again. Slow down, go slower. It should be easy. It doesn't have to be difficult to be beneficial. It's better to be too low than to be too high, okay? You can't really be too low. Obviously, if you're sitting and you're not doing anything, that's not high enough. But if you're training, if you're doing something, it's going to be really hard to go too slowly or to be too low and not get those adaptations, okay? So just go a little bit lower if you're not sure. Mistake number 2, using a fixed percentage of heart rate max. I don't think it's a good idea. I'd rather you use the estimation methods that I gave you, which are the talk test, the 2 to 3 out of 10, and the cardiac drift if you have a heart rate monitor. As you can see here with Thomas, from one test to the next, we can see significant differences in his heart rates at all those different powers. So he was on a bike, 4 minutes on, 1 minute off. These are the averages on the last minute of each step at the powers that you can see at the bottom here, starting at 100 watts all the way to 300 on the second test. And you can see that there's a significant difference in heart rate, more than 10 beats per minute change between test 1 and test 2. So do not use a fixed percentage of heart rate max. Another mistake that I often see is transferring results from one modality to another. Oh, I did a test on a bike. Can I use my heart rates and all that stuff to go running now? Is that gonna work? Again, most of the time it does not work, unfortunately. And if it does, I won't be able to tell you that it does. unless I test you in both modalities. So in general, do not use the same heart rate for biking and running. Usually running heart rate in zone 2 is going to be a little bit higher than the biking heart rate for zone 2. But again, that is highly individual. So make sure you treat those modalities for what they are and in their own regard. Another big mistake that I see is long circuits. Again, we don't want to be switching modality. And just to be clear, I have nothing against performing some movements of your sport, of your discipline at a low intensity in a circuit format. I think that's great. Okay, if you want to carry yokes and do some strongman movements on longer distances, longer time frames with lower loads, pushing sleds, all this stuff is fine. Okay, but call it for what it is. Zone 2 training, as we saw, is very specific from a physiological standpoint, from an intensity standpoint. And again, we want that cyclical motion, whether it's walking, whether it's cycling or else. And if you're switching every 2 minutes, it is not doing zone 2. So call it a low intensity circuit if you want, but know that zone 2 is not that. And the last mistake that I wanted to talk about here is increasing intensity too soon. What you have to think about when you're doing this low intensity training, once you've calibrated that zone 2 appropriately, is to increase volume. Okay, don't think about increasing intensity of that type of training too soon. Most people do it way too soon. Give yourself 2, 3, 4 months before you change the intensity at all. And I'm not saying you have to be fixed at a given intensity. I'll usually play around in that zone 2. Okay, always staying a little bit shy of that first threshold. Depending on the person or the session, we might go a little bit above. That's fine. And again, I'm not saying to never go above. We do go above, but when we go above, we know why and we know what we're doing. But when you're below, you can play around. Okay, let's say your zone 2 upper threshold is at 150 watts on a bike, to give a very simple example. Well, I might take as a reference point 140, 130, 120, and you might play around with that, right? On an hour session, you might do 10 minutes at 130, 10 minutes at 140, 10 minutes at 120, and then repeat again, 130, 140, 120. You're all in zone 2, gives a little bit of variation to the session. You go in a little bit up, a little bit down, and that can be a good way to vary things a little bit without getting out of that zone that we're looking for. Okay, give yourself time before you progress. Talking about progress, let's look at a couple examples. This is a graph from Jean-Yves, an ultra cyclist that I've been lucky to work with. So this was his zone 2 before. Okay, as you can see in green here. And after 8 weeks of training at the right intensity, note that Jean-Yves is an experienced ultra distance cyclist. He's been training for many decades. He's in his 60s, but he was training his zone 2 too high. And so when we did the test together and recalibrated his zone 2 and he lowered his training intensity, keep in mind again, Jean-Yves trains a lot, between 15 and 20 hours a week. So this 8-week progress was pretty significant. But again, given the volume of training that he was doing, that is not necessarily surprising. And as you can see here, his lactate curve went down and went to the right. And we saw about a 10 to 15 watt jump on his first threshold. And again, all his performance metric went up in that time as well. And you can go and check out the chat that I had with Jean-Yves about those results on my channel. I'll put the link just above right here. Also to note, very interesting from a health standpoint, Jean-Yves is a type 1 diabetic, and with the increased volume at the right intensity of this zone 2 training, in that 8-week period, he lowered his insulin intake by 40%. Okay, so again, we talked about performance quite a bit in this presentation, but from a health standpoint, glycemic control, all those things, I think that type of work is really, really important and should not be overlooked, especially when we talk about health. A few more examples of progress. All athletes that I've coached, Leah, Thomas, Tim, in different modalities, rowing, cycling, running, and again, the heart rate differences from one test to the next are significant, and the vast majority of the work that they were performing was low intensity zone 2 training. There was some intensity in their programs, okay, so this was not achieved solely with zone 2, although if we go back to the previous slide, Jean-Yves did only do low intensity training in those 8 weeks because he needed a bit of a change from what he was doing before. But just know that here we had other intensity elements at play as well. But for the most part, it was a vast majority of zone 2 training. So if we come to the conclusion here, what can we say about zone 2? What is it going to bring us? Better recovery. It's going to improve our performance as well. It's going to help us tolerate more training load or just stress load in general. It's going to spare our glycogen. It's going to make our cardiac system more efficient and bring some balance to our autonomic nervous system. If you have questions, now is time to ask them. I'll ask you to put them in the comments below. And I'd also like to ask you while you're here, if you already had or have experience with zone 2 training and you've seen the benefits from it, what I invite you to do is take a couple minutes to write a comment below. Tell us where you're from, what sport you perform, and how zone 2 has helped you so far. And the goal again is just for people to understand that this type of work is beneficial no matter what your background is, no matter what your sport is, no matter what your goal is, even from a health perspective. Everybody can benefit from it. Everybody should have this type of training in their program, at least at some periods of the year. And again, I want to thank you for watching this video from the very start all the way to the very end. I want to thank all the people that helped me put this together, my community that gave me feedback on the first draft. I was able to add some detail, add some information to it, and I hope make it better. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I remind you that it is my perspective. There's probably mistakes in there, and if there's things to change, please put some comments below as well. But again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next presentation. Take care.